Chapter 15. The Hole. For years, life bumped along relatively unpleasantly, as I have described, until the beginning of 2004, when David instituted something that later became infamous as the Hole. Stories abound on the internet about the abuses that occurred in the Hole, but no one to my knowledge has come forward with the rationale, if you can call it that, for its formation. Around 1979, L. Ron Hubbard determined that lack of proper marketing was the reason for the disappointing expansion of Scientology. He began a study of marketing texts and wrote numerous policy letters about marketing as it relates to Scientology. He ordered the establishment of a sizable marketing unit. He also decreed that if the management of Scientology ever dismantled marketing, the managerial arm itself was to be shut down and reconstructed. David used that order as a pretense to shut down management and confine executives to their offices, which at the time consisted of a pair of double-wide renovated trailers that had conference rooms, offices, and cubicles where management executives worked. At one point, iron bars were placed over windows, and a guard stood outside the only exit 24 hours a day. International management executives, along with executives from Gold, as well as other staff members David believed were a drag on his time and attention, were thrown into this purgatory. According to multiple accounts, people were not permitted to leave. While they were not particularly cramped for space, the conditions in the Hole were miserable. People who were there have told me that they slept on the floor, under desks, or in offices in sleeping bags. Once a day, they were marched down to the estate's maintenance building for a shower. They ate leftovers from the galley. Debbie Cook, a former Scientology executive, testified in a lawsuit that David had the air conditioning turned off as punishment during a 2-week stretch in the summer of 2007, when temperatures reached over 100 degrees. After Cook's testimony, the church issued a statement, saying that Cook was, quote, clearly bitter and falsely vilifying the religion she once was a part of, unquote. The daily activities of people in the Hole consisted of either writing down or verbally confessing their sins. Ostensibly, they were following Hubbard's protocol to get back into good graces within the group and Scientology in general. That procedure contained a series of steps one had to follow after having been declared a suppressive person. In other words, someone dedicated to the destruction of Scientology. That this would even be considered possible among the group of people who were inarguably the most dedicated Scientologists in the world tells you immediately how screwball the whole affair was. Despite the accounts of former members who experienced it firsthand, the church, in the person of a lawyer who was not under oath, put out a statement denying that the Hole ever existed. According to those who were in the Hole, the routine of people sitting in a room and writing page after page of their transgressions day after day later devolved into each of these people standing before the other restricted personnel and confessing their misdeeds or evil intentions. As described by Mike Rinder, a former top executive in the church, and other former Sea Org members, these group confessions were often brutal affairs. One person was directed to stand in front of the group, all told there must have been about 100 people in the Hole at various times, and confess the ways in which he or she had been ineffective on the job, hampered the expansion of Scientology, and worst of all, sabotage all the work David was doing to salvage Scientology, from who or what was never made clear. People formerly confined to the Hole say that if they failed to confess, or their confessions were deemed disingenuous, the person was screamed at and often slapped, pushed, and punched by other persons held there. Per published accounts, this went on for weeks, which turned into months, and some executives spent 5 to 7 years locked up there. The church denies that David has fostered a management culture that encourages physical abuse and says that when he learned that executives were physically abusing staff members, he put a stop to it and demoted the perpetrators. One day I came out of the music rehearsal building, which was just a stone's throw from where all this insanity was going on. Outside the trailers was a large U-Haul truck just sitting there. I speculated. They must be getting rid of some old furniture, or maybe buying new stuff. Maybe some stuff has to be moved from the other side of the property. I had no idea what that truck was doing there, but 2 days later it was gone, and I only recently found out why it was there. It was another cruel ruse cooked up by David to further nullify the people in the hole. People at Gold had no idea what was going on inside the building at the time, and if anybody did know, they weren't talking. Here is what multiple people who were involved told me and the press. One evening, David came down to the hole from his office carrying a boombox. He announced to the captives that he was going to show them what their inactivity, incompetence, and evil intentions were doing to the rest of humanity. He said they were going to play a game of musical chairs, and the song he had selected to play was Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, the lyrics to which include this famous line, just to drive the point home, "Nothing really matters to me." He further explained that anyone put out of the game would be banished from the base. They would be reposted to a small and failing church somewhere in a far corner of the globe. They would be separated from their spouse or other family members. Again, at the time, the people at Gold had no idea this had occurred, but I have been told it was traumatic for many. The U-Haul sitting outside was to be used to gather people's belongings. He had plane tickets booked to the far corners of the Scientology world, Australia, Africa, New Zealand. He made the threat very, very real. I have spoken to people who were forced to participate, and the stories are not pleasant. They say no one dared to call David on the charade he was enacting, and people played the game for blood. Clothes were torn, people were thrown around, chairs were broken. The most insane thing about it was that people were actually fighting to stay. In the end, nobody was sent away. The next day, people were left wondering when they would be moved off the base, but after a day or two they began to realize the whole thing had been nothing more than a threat, and a demonstration of the cruelty of which David was capable. The church told the Tampa Bay Times that the accounts of the musical chairs game by Mike Rinder and other former executives are overblown. The church claims that David was just trying to make a point about how personnel transfers are like musical chairs and can harm a group's progress. My wife Becky once heard David tell a church employee being considered for promotion that Hubbard had instructed David to disband and reform management if marketing ceased to be an important priority. As I said, David's justification for starting the hole was that marketing had shrunk beyond an irreducible minimum. Yet the flaw in his reasoning is illustrated by his not having followed the second part of Hubbard's order, to reconstruct management. To this day, so far as I know, no international management structure has been reformed with executives authorized to run assigned areas. In fact, the overall structure of base organizations was thrown into confusion at about the time the whole was created, with different units merged, then separated, and then merged again. Organizations were moved to one building, then back to their earlier location. Mass confusion was the order of the day, a day that lasted for years, and, for all I know, might still be going on. What's more, the person who dismantled marketing was David himself. My wife and close friends who worked in marketing tell me that with unrealistic time expectations, capricious rejections, changing his mind about broad strategies that were not communicated clearly but only tossed off in passing, "Oh, and by the way, that Plan X has to change," as well as through micromanaging every aspect of most marketing work, people had no real option other than to leave the area, either by escaping, called blowing, or being relieved of one's duties, being busted. So marketing dwindled. Per the organizational structure, there should have been at least half a dozen layers of management between the marketing staff and David, yet requests for marketing decisions went directly to him, and anyone in between was reduced to a rubber stamp. catching hell if they failed to submit paperwork to David on time. David always wanted things now. In that sense, he is not unlike the 3-year-old who sees something and wants it immediately, except that David has the unlimited and unquestioned authority to demand it. Becky worked in the marketing area for years and told me what life was like there. Some of the things David did with marketing give insight into the way he has mismanaged Scientology all over the world. Over time, the number of people in marketing had dwindled. Many of the departures were, you guessed it, the direct result of one of David's meddlesome spur-of-the-moment orders. Then 6 months later, he would find out how few people were left in marketing, often because of the insanely executed increase in personnel in another area, and he would pronounce himself shocked at the state of the area. He would go on a campaign to immediately bolster the marketing staff, and that, of course, necessitated taking personnel from another area, with the result that those areas now were becoming understaffed. This kind of du jour management style, capriciously focusing on one area this week and another area next week, kept the organization in a general state of turmoil, as you can imagine. The only stable thing about the organization at the base was its instability. David had a way of doing the same thing with individual staffers. Someone who was doing well on the job would come into favor with David. The staff member would be held up as an example of someone who was effective, productive, and most important, getting things done that COB wanted done. The object of this adulation naturally began to feel pretty good, especially in light of the general attitude toward most staff members, either that they were nobodies or people who were, in David's words, actively sabotaging what he was trying to accomplish. Since COB had made himself the unquestioned authority for all of Scientology, word that someone had received praise or acknowledgement from him spread quickly through the ranks, and that person quickly became known as being in David's good graces. What usually followed was a promotion to a position with greater responsibility, because David was always on the lookout for people he thought might be able to help him manage some area of Scientology, so he would not be saddled with doing everything myself, his most common refrain. Oftentimes, his latest golden child came from an organization that was lower than gold in the Scientology hierarchy and was brought to the international headquarters at gold. David would, of course, have briefed the Anointed One on what he, David, thought of the organizations and units on the base, and instilled his attitudes in his new favorite. These attitudes were invariably negative about everything at the base, so the new executive would be disaffected from the outset. It became fairly predictable that within 6 months, or a year at most, the golden child would fall out of favor and be removed from the job, or even relegated to the hole with the rest of management. This scenario was repeated often enough that the more hardened base staff would see a new executive as part of David's entourage and say under their breath, "Enjoy the honeymoon while it lasts, sucker." The result of such treatment was that the people around David spent their lives roller skating on bongo boards. They were constantly off balance. David had ways of keeping people off kilter. He might go into a meeting about, say, a marketing submission, and in attendance would be not only people from marketing, but also executives in charge of marketing, and even the senior executives for that area. Now, these other executives also had other areas of responsibility in addition to marketing. David might walk into the meeting and fire off pointed questions at one of the attending execs about something that was flapping, an unexpected emergency that is not being handled in another part of that person's job. He might tear into the executive about the flap for a minute or two before getting down to the actual business of the meeting. The person who received the dressing down would leave the meeting completely rattled, but others who had been present also felt destabilized, because they knew well that they could have been singled out. As a highly energetic micromanager, David knew just about everything of importance that was happening on the base, often more than the executive whose area it was. And you could see he took a measure of satisfaction in informing others of something flapping in a certain area. He wore mirrored sunglasses, the kind that hide the eyes, which made it difficult to read whether some remark he made was a joke or serious. He took obvious pleasure in keeping others guessing about what he meant by a statement he had made. He could say something in jest to someone who did not know how to take it, and that person would then be hit with a sharp, "Why aren't you laughing?" It worked both ways. Someone might say something humorous, and you could not tell how he took it because you could not see his eyes. The worst thing of all was when you thought he was joking and laughed when he was serious. Then you were done for. What the hell is so goddamn funny? Gulp. Another technique he used was to brief the base and use the occasion to denigrate a particular person or several people, depending on his mood, in front of the assembled staff. One leading executive, once a close friend of David's, became the subject of an entire briefing in which the executive's supposed attempts to undercut and even overthrow Dave, or so one witness told us, were laid out in detail for all to hear. The net result, of course, was to turn everybody on the base against the poor man. He was subsequently banished to live in a literal swamp on the base property for a year. He had to build his own lean-to out of bamboo and tarps and was restricted to a fenced-in area of maybe an acre. The result of the way David ran things was that people generally felt their jobs were in danger, or that wholesale changes might be made in their area at any time. As you would conclude, every area of the base that David was involved in was frantically busy, while producing almost nothing of value except under extreme duress. David used one other tactic, not just on marketing people, but on nearly everyone on the base: sleep deprivation. It became a source of tremendous pain, but also a twisted sense of pride if you could manage to stay awake during the ordeal. For someone to go without sleep for days on end after David had issued an impossible-to-achieve deadline. That was the way he instigated the practice. He never expressly demanded that people go without sleep. He did, however, demand, time and again, that something better be done by the time I come in the morning, which of course meant staying up all night to complete the task. Often meetings during which David issued the demand ran well into the evening, sometimes hours beyond what was necessary to communicate the order. Well, as any fool knows, going without sleep makes it harder to think, which results in poor decisions and mistakes. Naturally, David, well-rested and fed when he arrived at work the following day, would spot the typos or poorly thought-out proposal, blow a gasket and send the submission back in flames, and the whole thing would begin again, resulting in even more mistakes. Meanwhile, people went without sleep. The situation became chronic for some staff members, and it was not unusual for people to exist for months on a few hours of sleep a night, rarely seeing their own beds, and often sleeping at their desks or on the office carpet. Sleep deprivation spread nearly base-wide around event time, when David's usual state of bad temper ramped up to new levels. His excuse was that he was surrounded by incompetence, and the only one he could count on to hold the line on quality was himself. Of course, demanding a standard of quality that is absolute or unobtainable is just another way to gum up the works and bring everything to a halt. I think David knew this, and from time to time imposed these standards simply because he could. In his mind, everyone else who was working on the show was useless, or worse, out to sabotage the entire event. So in addition to having to deal with the dead tiredness, lack of proper meals, no showers, no changes of clothes, and a routine of coffee and cigarettes, people also were subjected to doses of invalidation and nullification, dished out multiple times per day. It was nuts. I was never thrown into the hole, and neither was most of the Gold staff. Nevertheless, the effects of the hole seeped into the organization and made life even more distasteful, if that was possible. David engineered this by throwing some or all of the Gold executives into the hole for a couple of weeks. When they were released, they were expected to take the lessons they had learned during their incarceration and apply them to the rest of Gold. And they did. There were frequent daily verbal and even physical fights among the general staff. Upbraiding people at musters and staff meetings became the standard mode of operation. What became known as group seances occurred at Gold. Personnel responsible for areas that were flapping were forced to stand in front of the entire group and confess their sins, as was done in the whole. The allusion to seances was sarcastic, since the purported purpose of these exercises was to create a magical change in the overall organization, wherein Gold would suddenly become a cohesive, productive team overnight. I hope that I am communicating at least a whisper of the craziness of these times. Nullification of junior staffers by senior staffers became the norm. At the weekly staff meetings or on random occasions, the staff was gathered and various people would be brought to the front and ordered to tell the group what you are doing to sabotage COB's orders. If the person came up with something to satisfy the growing bloodlust, people would shout out, "What else did you do? When? Why?" and badger the person. At times, these group confessions were not dissimilar to descriptions in Lord of the Flies. On Saturdays, the general schedule was a bit different than on weekdays. People were allowed out of their offices to work around the base, helping maintain the grounds or work on new construction projects. For most, it was the best day of the week. Being outdoors, getting some fresh air, learning to do something new was a joy compared to the rest of the week. People worked on renovations until dinner. In the evening, there might be a base briefing from COB or the playing of one of Hubbard's lectures. All the units on the base attended. It was mandatory. RTC people were also there, but not to enjoy the lecture. A half-dozen of them would stand along each wall of the dining hall. Their job was to scan the audience and look for any staff members who might be falling asleep, looking disagreeable about anything being said, not paying attention, whatever. After the briefing or lecture, the guilty parties were hauled into the ethics section of their unit and worked over for not being with the program. We've all heard similar stories, but usually they are associated with Red China or East Germany, not an officially recognized church in the United States of America. The end result of these tactics was that David instilled such fear in people that if he gave an order and someone misinterpreted it and did something wrong, that person was certain they would be crushed. People became stimulus response robots. Fear pervaded the base, and no doubt there are people still there, as well as those who have left who are scarred by the abuse. I have mentioned the way David compensated for his small size at school by picking fights, but I am positive that there was another much more important influence that shaped the way he behaved as leader of the church. And this influence was L. Ron Hubbard himself. Back in Mount Carmel, a lot of guys joined one of the branches of the military after high school. One weekend after boot camp, I was back home hanging out, and there was a guy who had joined the Air Force and also was on leave. We were just sitting around talking, and I, as well as some others, noticed that this guy was now talking with a Southern accent. Somewhere in the Air Force, he had picked up a Southern accent. People from Mount Carmel do not talk like that. We said nothing, but figured that he was not being himself. It was like he was wearing the personality of someone else, probably a superior. Scientology calls this being in another person's valence. Valence is just a fancy word for identity. I never met or worked with L. Ron Hubbard, but I have known a number of people who did. Quite a few, in fact, including some of the original messengers who were with him on the Apollo. All have told me that he could be absolutely horrible to work with at times. Just a frothing, screaming madman when he was in a foul mood and things were not going well around him. David worked with him enough to witness these outbursts many, many times. Unlike everybody else who also saw these tantrums, David apparently used these as mentoring experiences. He, of course, adopted them with the energy and dedication that he did everything else in Scientology. He has taken LRH's valence. I am convinced of it. But Hubbard also had a sunny side. He could be compassionate and caring, and his general demeanor was pretty cheerful. In fact, I am told that he was more often sunny than thundering. David must never have paid attention to that part of Hubbard's personality, because in my many last years of associating with David, the sun rarely, if ever, shone.